I thought I'd try something a little bit different today. Let's see if it's going to work. Alexa, can you give a lecture on economics for me?
I don't know that.
Well, I guess I'll have to do this one myself then. Okay, I want to talk about the Federal Reserve. We're talking about the tools that the Federal Reserve has. And I want to talk today about the second tool the Fed has, something called the discount rate. Now, what we talked about previously is the idea that sometimes there's a fall in aggregate demand. Maybe the stock market crashes. Consumer confidence is really important. Right after 9/11, people were afraid, so they didn't want to go out and spend money. Something happens and aggregate demand falls. The Fed wants to take action to raise aggregate demand, raise GDP, and reduce unemployment. Think about it. When you're a senior and you're graduating, you'd like there to be very low unemployment. You want to be able to get a job. You don't want to have to go home and live in your parents' basement. So that being the case, we talked about one thing the Fed could do, and that was lower the reserve requirement. If they're worried that aggregate demand is too high, prices are too high, they can raise the reserve requirement. But they find changing the reserve requirement, the first tool, very disruptive to change. So let's look at the second tool, something that they actually do use. And the second tool is something called the discount rate. Now, the discount rate, it's just the interest rate that a central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve, winds up charging banks when they want to borrow money from the Fed. So let's see how that might work. Let's go back to an example like we did before. And suppose the Fed, the Board of Governors, sets the reserve requirement. What this means is the percent of deposits that must be held in reserve. In other words, not loaned out. You can keep money in reserve. A bank can keep money in reserve either physically at the bank or they can deposit it at one of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. So you'll find banks in Delaware, if they have extra money, they'll put it in an armored truck and send it up to Cleveland and deposit it there. And if they need a little more cash around, they might send an armored truck up to Cleveland and bring the cash down that they have deposited there. So the Board of Governors, those supposed to be 7 people, right now only 5, two of the seats are vacant. Suppose these people set the reserve requirement at 15%. And suppose banks want to loan out all they can. So if our bank has $100,000 deposited and the reserve requirement is set at 15%, can you figure out what reserves are going to be? How much they can loan out if they loan out everything they can, and what total assets are. Think about that for a second. And the answer is they have to keep 15% of their deposits in reserve, 15,000. They can loan out 85,000, the balance, and their total assets are 100,000. These two assets and liabilities have to balance. If assets are greater than liabilities, the bank, that's called the bank's net worth. And usually in the real world, banks do have a net worth greater than zero. Can banks ever have net worth less than zero? Yes, they can, and that means they're in trouble. Okay, so here's the situation. Our bank is all set up. Everything is, nice and cozy. One of the depositors wants to withdraw $10,000 that they deposited. If you put money in the bank, you have the right to go in and withdraw that money from the bank. So that being the case, if somebody wants to withdraw their $10,000, they can legally do that. And if they do, now the bank only has $90,000 deposited. Well, wait a second. Where does this $10,000 come from? It comes from their reserves. They can say to people, would you pay your loan back early? And the people would say, please take a long walk off a short pier. So the money comes out of reserves. And the result is, if $10,000 is withdrawn, the bank only has $5,000 lying around. They've loaned out $85,000 and the bank has a problem. The problem that the bank has is, I'll go back to the slide for a second, they have to keep 15% of their deposits in reserve. 15% of 90,000 is 13,500. They have to keep that amount in reserve and they only have 5. They don't meet the reserve requirement. What can the bank do? They're supposed to have at least 15% and they don't. Well, what they can do is they can borrow it from the Federal Reserve. The interest rate that the Fed charges the banks is called the discount rate. Those people on the Board of Governors, it's supposed to be 7, but right now it's only 5, those people decide what the discount rate is going to be. So they say to the bank, okay, if you want to borrow money from us because you don't have enough in reserve, this is the interest rate that we are going to charge you. Now, this rate is currently at a very low 0.25%. Obviously, you've been seeing what's happening in the economy. The Fed has dropped the discount rate tremendously in the last month. It went from about 1.5% down to 0.25%. So they've been doing this to tell banks, hey, if you run short, we'll loan you the money. So now, if that's the case, the bank can borrow money from the Fed. Let's say they borrow $10,000. Now they owe $90,000 to the to their customers. They owe $10,000 to the Fed, and they would have to keep 15% of 90,000. That's 13,500 in reserve. So this bank actually has, between the reserves and the cash they borrowed from the Fed, they have 15,000. They have more than they need. They only have 90,000 in deposit when somebody took out that money. So if banks run short, the Fed serves as the banker of last resort to other banks. If they need money, they go to the Fed. This is where they can get the money. Now, I always like to bring in the real world, and in the real world, very little money is actually borrowed from the Fed at the discount rate. Now wait, where do they get the money if they don't borrow it from the Fed? Banks do run short. They borrow it from other banks. So the discount rate, it looks really bad if you borrow from the Fed. If you find out, hey, my bank got caught short, they had to borrow from the Federal Reserve, that doesn't look good. People lose confidence in the bank. If you don't have confidence in the bank, you're going to pull your money out, the bank is even more trouble. It looks like it's even in more trouble because people have lost confidence. So very little money is borrowed at the discount rate. I love to use an analogy, or maybe it's a metaphor. I should study English more. Okay, the discount rate is like a speeding ticket. Imagine you're driving from Delaware to Columbus. Boy, I'd like to about right now. And a speeding ticket, the speed limit's 55 last time I checked. Suppose a speeding ticket is $5 and the speed limit is 55. How fast would you drive? I bet some of you out there are saying, how fast will my car go? But, if the penalty is very small, you're going to go over the limit. You don't care. It's like a little slap on the wrist, no big deal. Suppose if you get caught speeding even 1 mile over the limit, they take away your license for 6 months and fine you $10,000. How fast would you go if the speed limit was 55? The answer is probably about 45. You wouldn't take a chance. The discount rate is telling banks, look, if you get caught short, will there be a big penalty, a very high discount rate, or a small penalty, a very low discount rate? So the best way of thinking about the discount rate is that it's just telling them, what is the penalty if you get caught short? Now, banks do borrow from each other. And when they get caught short, that's what they do. The rate is called the federal funds rate. It's also right now at about 0.25%. Actually, it's between 0 and 0.25%. Usually, the federal funds rate, the rate that banks loan money to each other when one bank gets short, it's not set by the government. It's set by the supply of money and the demand of money. In other words, how much do banks want to loan to other banks? They don't gain any interest if the money's just sitting in the bank. And what's the demand by other banks? Almost always, the federal funds rate is lower than the discount rate, but they're very close. They track each other. They follow each other very closely. what you can see here is this is the actual federal funds rate, the rate at which banks borrow money from each other, going back to before the Great Recession. We saw that the federal funds rate, the rate banks loan money to one another, was at about, 5.25%. But as the economy cooled off and the Fed took actions to bring down interest rates, they greatly reduced the discount rate from about 5.5% down to 0.25%. Interest rates dropped to near zero, the lowest they've been in my lifetime. And you can see up until about January of 2016, interest rates were very low. Banks could easily borrow from another bank. This was done to stimulate the economy after the Great Recession. But the Fed said, you know what? If another recession comes along, we better have our powder dry. We better have something that we can do. So the Fed began gradually raising interest rates. And earlier last year, the Fed was raising interest rates. It got up to about 2.5%, 2.25%, somewhere in that neighborhood. President Trump was very angry about that. He said, look, you're hurting the recovery because you're raising interest rates. The Fed said, God forbid there's another tragedy or something goes on. If we have to drop interest rates, we want to be able to be somewhat above zero so we can drop interest rates. Guess what happened? COVID. And the bottom fell out of the economy. So what we've seen over the last few months is a dramatic decline in the federal funds rate, a dramatic decline in the discount rate. The discount rate was about 2.5%, late last year. Now it's about 0.25%. The Fed has been doing this intentionally. They've dropped the discount rate as a signal to banks, hey, interest rates are going to be lower. The federal funds rate has followed, and interest rates are once again back to close to, or really at record lows. It's very hard to have a negative interest rate. In other words, why would I loan out $1,000 if somebody had to pay me back less than $1,000? I wouldn't do it. I would just keep the money in a safety deposit box. It would be riskless. So, wait a second. We've talked about the fact the reserve requirement is very rarely changed. It hasn't been changed in your lifetime. China has lowered the reserve requirement a few times in 2015, and they did it again, recently. And the discount rate, very little money is borrowed at that. So how does the Fed actually wind up influencing interest rates? And the third tool which is used on a weekly basis is something called open market operations. And there's a special tool that's used only in the case of emergencies. That's called quantitative easing. And guess what? We'll save that for next time, unless Alexa can figure out how to deliver the lecture for me.